The new Maschine Plus is out and the internet seems to go crazy. Everybody is raving about it. You know, some YouTubers tell you this is the best thing since Jesus, and then there are others who tell you that this is the worst thing because it doesn't have a touch display or it doesn't have like 1 million samples or yada 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 yada. And instead of focusing on the features, because sometimes I think that features are the most boring part of an instrument, I would rather tell you something about what this means for the music industry or the technology that we are using right now. The Maschine, the original Maschine, came out in 2009 and it came with a concept and a promise. Back then we were all to be told that standalone units are from an old era. Now it's all within the computer and you should be using a controller and just your computer to make music, and the other stuff is gone. You know, why would you spend that much money on an MPC when you can have a machine with like 6 gigabytes of samples already from the get-go? And there was an argument to be made because back then it was quite expensive to get sample libraries. I mean, I believe I paid so much money for just really weak samples back then. The Maschine sample library that came stock with it was just amazing. It had the best sound back then and it was just a good starting point. And to this day, I hear Maschine samples in many productions. But with this kind of samples and this amount of samples, there came a trade-off. And the trade-off was the browsing system. Because as fun as it might seem to flick through thousands of kick drum samples, it was also very cumbersome. So with that technology, this like huge amounts of samples, came the struggle of the librarian and the browsing system. And Maschine and many other DAWs tried to cope with that amount of samples. And myself included, I was beginning to think that maybe it's interesting to have just one unit that can do stuff very good. And then you just have some samples that you created yourself and you just tweak them to the extent that you find that this is a new sound that inspires you. And that was something that came up, I believe, in 2015. We found so many artists going back to Albogi, to hardware, and it was just something that we found to be very refreshing, and you were going away from the computer, away from the screen even, you know? You were just in the mood and you just would listen to music. And I think that is what's now in the big scheme of music technologies, people going back to the standalone unit. And I mean, the term standalone is a funny thing, because what you're actually saying is that this is just a unit by itself, or let's call it an instrument. You know, a piano doesn't need a computer to work, or a guitar doesn't need an iPad to work correctly. It's the unit itself that makes it great. And I felt the same about MPCs. The MPC concept is something that is entrenched in that idea of a very, very flexible and very intuitive system or instrument. And that's why it is so great. I mean, look what the original Maschine will cost you now on eBay and what the MPC 1000 will cost you. That says a lot about longevity of these controller products. Because let's face it, when you buy into a controller, you are buying in an obsolete technology. At some point, the controller will be obsolete. And we found that with DJ controllers, with instrument controllers, with many things. There will be a point of no return when the operating system doesn't longer support your controller. And what made instruments so great were their flexibility and their independent state. So you could use anything in your studio for 30 or 40 years. I've worked with a lot of different musicians and they have their stuff like now for 20 years, 30 years. They love it to death. They know everything inside out of that unit. And I always felt that this is something that is gone with just a controller. So why now? Why now the Maschine Plus? I think Native Instruments is a little bit late in that game. To be honest, I thought that the Maschine Plus would have been great 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, when the original Maschine Studio came out, many people, including myself, believed that this would be a standalone unit. And it wasn't, and that was a downer. I mean, we paid like 1,000 euros. I don't know what you guys paying overseas in US dollars, but it was a lot of money, and it was still a controller with a lot of samples. But at some point, there's just a point of oversaturation. You don't need more plugins, you don't need more samples. You just need an instrument. You need something that you love to work with and that just works great. You go into your studio, you turn it on, and it makes sounds, and it works like you would like to work in a certain kind of mood. That's what an instrument gives you. And now Native Instruments tries to replicate that feeling, and I hope they will succeed. What the problem with the Maschine Plus for me is the limitations that it has. And I don't mean like touch displays or just the amount of RAM, because this is nothing to worry about. My EMU sampler, my beloved 6400 Ultra EMU sampler, has 128 megabytes of sample RAM, and I never need it. I just work with like 16 megabytes or like sometimes 60 megabytes, but for the pads and for the sounds that I use, it's great. I just love it for what it is. I love it for the sound. What the problem for me is with the Maschine Plus and so many other units that are out now is the lack of digital I/O connectivity. And what I mean by that is there is no SPDIF, no Toslink, no ADAT. And I know for many of you guys, this is something strange because you probably never used that. But what actually is so great about ADAT and SPDIF is these are open formats that everyone can implement with no huge additional costs. And what this gives you is 8 channels of 24 bits at 44.1 kilohertz. And this is a great feature. I mean, imagine how you could increase the flexibility of your Maschine Plus if you would have ADAT and you could hook up a normal 8-channel mic pre or conversion box or anything else just to work with that, and just at some point in like 10 or 20 years when the conversion power is so much greater that you could use that one instead of still this old line input and output system. And I know you would say now, okay, there at some point there will be some kind of like vintage sound to this, but I don't think so, because these like probably they will use like really stock ADDA chips, and they are good, but they're nothing to brag about. It's not like I'm a fetishist when it comes to conversion, but it's nothing great, you know. At some point, yeah, these are probably just stack converters. So I would love to use my beloved RME ADI2 Pro. Okay, probably you guys have figured out that I'm an RME guy, but I love to use that converter. And to be able to use my converter or the ADI2 Pro 5 that will come out in 6 or 7 years or 10 years, I don't know, to use that with the Maschine Studio or the Maschine Plus, that would have been great. So what I hope they will do is put on a nice mode that will allow you to use class-compliant audio interfaces, meaning you can use one of the USB ports and hook up a class-compliant interface and just use that as an audio input and output, because that will increase the flexibility. Apart from that, the Maschine Plus is probably a great unit. I mean, the ability to have the VSTs is huge, the chord modes is great, it looks sleek. I would prefer to have SSDs instead of SD cards because I don't trust SD cards that much, but it's a nice flexible little tool, and hopefully Native Instruments will implement more features, will put up more, you know, and just maybe have a Studio Plus, you know, 8 ins, 8 outs with digital connectivity. That would be amazing. What I wanted to tell you is, don't always believe what the status quo or the de facto standard is at some point in time. Believe what you like and what you appreciate in an instrument. Because when it comes down to what we should do is making music, or sometimes just having fun. But if you feel that something is right for you and that you appreciate the sound that comes out of it and the workflow, then stick to that. Still to this day, I love my MPC 4000, I love my EMU sampler, I love my old vintage samplers in general, and my synths. And these are all instruments that have been built by people that appreciate a good instrument and they like to build something that they would use themselves. And if you get that feeling with the controller, okay, fine, but I would always urge you to think a bit more about longevity and something that you will use probably in like a time frame of 20 to 30 years. And so much of my gear is older than 30 years. And this is something that is special about the music industry, that we can appreciate gear from a long gone era. Okay, I see you next time on this channel, and let me know in the comment section if you have ever used ADAT or SPDIF, what you would like to have seen in the Maschine Plus, and I see you next time on this channel. Thanks for watching, guys, and have a good day.